Well, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Sharon Bonney. I'm the Executive Director for the Coalition on Adult Basic Education, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar today, Reading, Writing, and Relationships. I first wanted to mention that all the webinar participants will receive a certificate of attendance. This will go out to you by 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time tomorrow. You can use this certificate of attendance for a CEU verification, and also any of the information that's shared here will be posted to our website, so you can download it at your convenience later on as well. Most of you are aware that we have an adult educators resource repository. There's a lot of wonderful materials out there. I'd like to encourage everybody on this webinar to go out and check out this link here. I'll put it in the chat box as well. There's resources. You can also start chatting there on the resource repository, and you can also rate the resources that are out there as well. So it's just a wonderful resource that's provided to us through Essential Academy. Okay, so upcoming events. We have coming soon our national conference that's taking place March 25th through the 28th in Phoenix, Arizona. And right now, COAB is offering the opportunity to compete for mini grants that will defray the cost of conference registration. So the mini grants are valued at $350. They're provided to us through Dollar General Literacy Foundation. And I just want to encourage anybody that's a member, you can go out and you can look at our COAB website, www.coab.org, and apply for a mini grant to attend our national conference. At that national conference, we'll have about 370 sessions, concurrent sessions that will take place, and they'll cover over 30 strands. So lots of different topics and sessions delivered by the best presenters in the field. Also, right now, we have our Educate and Elevate National Public Awareness Campaign going on. And we're really excited about this. This Educate and Elevate Public Awareness Campaign has just won 6 International Davies Awards, which we're real proud of. And it's also, we're going to be featured on PBS, CNN, and Fox News, and a number of the other stations. We'll be doing an interstitial and a documentary about adult education. So that's coming soon. You can look for that during the month of March. In the meantime, if you go to educateandelevate.org, you'll see more information about our public awareness campaign. So today, I wanted to mention that as you know, we're focusing on reading and writing. In our summer 2015 issue, there was an article all about reading. And as you can see, I have it pulled up here. Last Reader Standing, the story of a man who learned to read at 54. And I wanted to mention this because what we'd like to do is we'd like to tie in our journal along with our webinars, as well as our resources in our repository. So you can go to our journal. Our journal is free if you download it electronically. You can find that at www.coab.org/journal. This is all part of our Research to Practice initiative. Our Research to Practice initiative is generously funded by Essential Education. And each webinar, we attempt to address a question. This particular webinar, we're addressing the question, how do you motivate student learning? So without further ado, I'd like to mention that our webinar presenter, CARRIE STELL, is the one who will be presenting today. And you can see there she has a great resume, and she has been a presenter for a number of years here. And I'm just pleased to welcome CARRIE STELL. So CARRIE, I'll turn this over to you.
So hi everybody, I am CARRIE STELL, and I'm really, really excited to be here to be able to share with you some ideas I've developed, resources I've discovered as a former public school teacher, former homeschooler, and a current full-time adult ed instructor. So with that, I'm going to make my slow way to my screen to share with you all. Let's see, here we go. You'll bear with me for a moment. Here we go. Oh. Excuse me. I am an adult educator, but I'm not very tech savvy. And I think I'm here. Okay, so what I wanted to say is that I'm hopeful that what I have to share will be helpful to any adult teaching adults, and that it can help you help your students in the classroom. Reading, writing, and relationships. So reading and writing, of course, teachers have been teaching this for eons. The relationships, I like to pick and choose what I have my students read, what we read together with great intention and care. I'll just tell you a little bit about my philosophy when it comes to reading, and in particular, reading aloud and having my students write in response to what we're reading.
Carrie?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes,
I'm sorry to interrupt. We can't see your screen.
Oh, dear.
We cannot see your screen.
Okay. So
you just want to go down to that green share button screen, or share button icon.
Okay. So here, I'm so sorry, folks.
That's okay.
Okay.
While she's doing that, I'm just going to ask everybody that's here on this webinar, we have 106 people, please go over to the chat box there and put in your name and where you're from and how many people are there in the room with you. So while she's pulling up her screen, maybe we could have some interaction from our audience. Just go right over to that chat box, put your name, where you're from, and how many people are in the room with you. Great, and now we see that your screen is coming up, Carrie, so we're good there.
So let me find the play.
Great.
I'm looking for the slowly but surely. Here we go, is this the play? It's actually, let me see if I can move it, because here we go. Okay, are we together now?
Perfect.
Okay, and I apologize.
Good job.
Okay,
no problem.
So we're back together again. Choosing reading selections based on knowing that the adult students that come into my classroom, and no doubt your classroom too, are facing challenges in their life, in their relationships. And when we focus on things that we can read and learn from, we're not just learning about reading and writing, not just learning to pass tests, to get a high school equivalency, but ultimately learning to be a better person and to relate to others. And this is a very lofty goal. And I hope by the end of it all, you'll get some ideas and see some resources that can help you do what I'm striving to do in my classroom. And that is basically to motivate them to want to learn and to just encourage them and to inspire them, not just as learners, as people. So here's what we're going to do today. During today's webinar, we will discuss why, how, and what to read aloud to adults. I will be sharing more than 20 questions to ask while reading. I will read one children's illustrated book, Wolfie the Bunny, aloud to demonstrate how I would read an illustrated children's book. And finally, I'm going to preview recommended read aloud selections, writing prompts, and additional activities. So these were all attachments that I hope you received in an email, and I hope you had a chance to print them off. Not to worry if you didn't. I'm going to be sharing a lot of information, but you do not need to take copious notes, because all of the pertinent details, the titles, the authors, the writing prompts, the links to activities, it's all in the attachments in the email. And so if you don't have it printed and in front of you, after the fact, you can go ahead and print it. So I don't want you to panic if you can't get everything down, because it is all on paper and you will have access to it. So why would we read aloud to adults? Well, I'm sure you can think of a lot of reasons. I've listed a number of reasons on the first attachment that I've shared with you, but the bottom line is it does motivate our students. We can encourage them as learners, so many benefits. And I should just give you a spoiler alert. The reading I'm talking about is reading aloud with my adult students, so I can model some of the methods. And the writing I'm talking about is encouraging them to write in response to what we're reading and discussing together. If you look at that first attachment, if you have it, in addition to discussing why we would want to read aloud with adults, I want to talk about how to read aloud with adults. And again, I have multiple tips on this, but first I'd just like to encourage you, if this is something that you're not comfortable doing, I guarantee you will get better at it with practice. And I can guarantee that you will already be better at it than any of your students. So they're going to think you're wonderful. And you're just going to get more and more wonderful the more you do it. So I'd encourage you, if it's not something that's in your usual educational arsenal, to try this out. So the two most important tips I listed on how to read aloud are: make the text that you are reading aloud visible to your students. I have an Elmo, a mounted camera attached to a digital projector, and I can put that on a television screen in one classroom. I can put it on a whiteboard in another classroom. If you don't have that, and when I don't have access to that, I do make hard copies. I will print the text because I want my students to see what I'm reading while I'm reading it. That's what helps their fluency. They can see pronunciation, they can notice spelling, see how it aids in their comprehension. So most important thing is they're not just listening, they're also seeing as I read aloud to them. And then the next most important tip is punctuating your reading periodically with purposeful questions. And this brings me to my second attachment: more than 20 questions to ask while reading. And this is a list of more than 20 questions. When I first introduced it to my students, we played 20 questions, a game that not all of them were familiar with, where I would think of someone and they'd go around the room, ask me yes or no questions and try and figure it out. The questions I've got listed here, I developed this when I found, as I was reading aloud with my students, I kept having to repeat myself. I would ask them what conclusions could they draw, or what inferences could they make, and they would forget what that meant. And so this handout explains both verbs and nouns, many of the reading skills, thinking skills, as well as reading skills that they need to have in order to do well on the GED and other high school equivalency tests. When I'm reading to them, I want them to become accustomed to the way they're going to be asked questions on their high school equivalency test. And so I'm modeling this for them. I try not to interrupt myself too much, but by the end of the paragraph, I'll ask appropriate questions. They'll respond. We'll talk about it, and then we'll move on. So I model this. We practice it as a whole group. They can practice it in small groups, and ultimately the goal is they'll get into the habit of doing this when they're reading on their own as well. So if you have, hopefully you've got some of these in front of you. I'll just, as a quick highlight, if you have the attachment in front of you, actually I'm gonna leave it alone, because what I'm gonna do is demonstrate it. So the book that I'd like to share with you first is, and the only book I'm planning to share with you today, other than titles and authors and so forth, is Wolfie the Bunny by Amy Dickman and illustrated by Zachariah O'Hora. I'm going to act like you're my students and interrupt myself, punctuate the reading periodically with purposeful questions. And the first question I'd ask my students is, what do you notice on the cover? What do you imagine? And I would use the academic word, what can you predict that this story would be about? And let them take some time just to focus on the cover of the book. And as it begins, the bunny family came home to find a bundle outside their door. What do you imagine is in that basket? They peeked, they gasped. It was a baby wolf. He's adorable, said Mama. He's ours, said Papa. He's going to eat us all up, said Dot. but Mama and Papa were too smitten to listen. Can you tell from the context what smitten means? How Mama and Papa reacted to that bundle on their doorstep? Wolfie slept through the night, but Dot did not. Can you infer why not? Mama served carrots for breakfast. He likes them. Eater, said Papa. Speaking of eating, said Dot, he's going to eat us all up. But Mama and Papa were too busy taking pictures to listen. Dot's friends came by to see the baby. He's sleeping, whispered Mama. He's a good sleeper, whispered Papa. He's going to eat us all up, they screamed. No kidding, said Dot. Let's play at your house. For the first time, Wolfie cried, but Dot was too far away to hear him. Can you infer why Wolfie is crying? What is being implied here? When Dot returned, Wolfie was waiting. Everywhere Dot went, Wolfie went too. He's drooling on me, said Dot. He's a good drooler, said Papa. The days passed and Wolfie grew. So did his appetite. When Mama opened the cupboard, she got a surprise. The carrots, said Mama. They're gone. Oh no, said Papa. He ate them all up, said Dot. Dot fetched the carrot bag, but she did not get far. Can you predict what's about to happen? What do you think is going through Wolfie's mind? He wants to help, said Mama. He's a good helper, said Papa. He's going to, oh, skip it, said Dot. I've got my eye on you, Buster. Wolfie and Dot went to the carrot patch. Dot was picking one last carrot when Wolfie's mouth opened wide. I knew it, cried Dot. What is being implied that she knew? What conclusion can you draw? What's she thinking? Do you notice her say, on guard, holding a carrot like a weapon? But Wolfie wasn't looking at Dot. Dinner, roared the bear. It was Dot's chance to run away. Instead, she ran forward. Let him go, Dot demanded, or I'll eat you all up. The bear blinked. You're a bunny, he said. I'm a hungry bunny, said Dot. But I'm bigger than you, said the bear. I'll start on your toes, said Dot. Help! cried the bear. She's going to eat me all up! Dot relaxed as the bear ran away. "We're safe," she said. Then Wolfie pounced. Can you predict what's likely to happen next? Come on, little brother. Let's go home and eat. And that's the end of Wolfie the bunny. And so this is a children's illustrated book, and I've listed more than 20 of them. This is at the top of my list. We can use it for English language learners. We can use it for struggling readers. We can use it for adults who want to be able to read to young children. But we can also use it to practice the reading and thinking skills adults need to be able to take and pass the high school equivalency tests, particularly when we are using the language that the high school equivalency tests use. When we talk about summarizing a story, when we talk about the mood of a story, assumptions, themes, characters in the story, when we ask our students to talk about the character that Dot revealed, what adjectives would they use to describe her? What synonyms could they come up with to describe her? If you were my students, we'd be having a conversation right now about the theme of the book and discussing the difference between the topic or the subject of the book. Of course, they're talking about sibling rivalry. They're talking about adoption and parenting. They're talking about prejudice and judging people by what they look like on the outside. But those are topics, those are subjects. You know, the themes go beyond that. You know, what does this say about the relationships between siblings who may fight like cats and dogs or like bunnies and wolves, but in the end, they may really care about each other, even defend each other. We might talk about the theme of not judging a book by its cover or a wolf by his fur, or certainly a person. So that you can go pretty deep with a children's book as you're looking for opportunities to discuss some reading and thinking skills. So that was Wolfie the bunny. So what else can we be reading aloud to adults? The third handout that I have shared with you, the third attachment to the email, lists titles of 24 illustrated children's books. It'll give you the title, the author, and many of them, 9 of them in fact, are based on true stories. I'm rather partial to true stories. I do indicate when they are based on a true story. And then I've also listed adult nonfiction. Again, I'm partial to autobiographies and biographies, and I've written, or I'm recommending 9 titles. And this particular list just recommends, just lists their titles and their authors. There's one fiction book as well that I've included on the list. And so this brings us to the final attachment, which is a 5-page attachment. And so it's pretty dense with information. And again, I just want to tell you, it's great if you actually had the chance to print it off and you have it in front of you, but please don't worry if you don't, because just about everything I'm saying is on the attachment. And so the most important information, from title to author to specific pages and chapters that I recommend, specific prompts that I suggest, they're there. The other thing I'll mention to you, if you do have this 5-page document in front of you, recommended read aloud selections, writing prompts, and additional activities. The way I've organized it is I started with Wolfie the Bunny, and then I moved on to number 1 was Wolfie the Bunny. Number 2 through 9, these are all the titles of the adult books that I recommend. But under each of the adult books, you find the author, you see quotes, you see read aloud, selections, chapters, pages I suggest you read. Some of these books I've read cover to cover, but I still have highlighted particular sections that you might read aloud, writing prompts, and then below that, under each of the adult books I recommend, I have recommendations for English language learners, struggling readers, and family literacy students. And there will be 2, 3, or 4 recommendations of the illustrated children's books. And I've grouped them together with the adult titles because they have parallel themes. And I think as you look more closely at the document, that'll become apparent. So what I'm going to do now is just take you on a quick slideshow of the covers of these books. It'll give you a sense of some of the beautiful artwork, particularly in the children's books. But again, you'll get more details when you look more closely at the 5-page handouts. The first book, adult book that I'm recommending is A Million Miles in 1,000 Years, How I Learned to Live a Better Story by Donald Miller. And there's one chapter in particular entitled How Jason Saved His Family that I would recommend. And it's how he, in 3 pages, it talks about a 13-year-old daughter doing drugs, has a boyfriend that the father thinks is influencing her to do drugs, and how he decided to stop yelling at his daughter and instead created a better story to invite her into. And it involved serving other people. Their family ended up, and he did this without his wife's knowledge, and he admits that he got into a little bit of trouble for doing this, but committing to building an orphanage in Mexico. And the difference this made in his daughter's life and in his family's life. So underneath the writing prompt for that one particular chapter that I recommend are 3 titles. Illustrated children's books. Beatrice's Goat is the story of how the donation of a goat to a family, a girl in a family in Uganda, the difference it made in her family. Give a Goat is a children's book about a 5th grade class that read the book, Beatrice's Goat, and decided they too wanted to raise the money and buy a goat to donate to a family. And then the last book, Our Heroes, How Kids Are Making a Difference. And you know what, folks, forgive me. I told you I was going to let you take a look at the covers. This is Beatrice's Goat. Here's Give a Goat, the story of the 5th grade class that also bought a goat to send to Uganda. And finally, Our Heroes, How Kids Are Making a Difference, are true stories of kids ages 7 to 13 from not only the US, but around the world, making a difference in their communities and in the world. And it starts with helping one person. So I'll try not to be negligent again, showing you these covers of these books. So the next adult book I recommend is also by Donald Miller. It's Scary Close, Dropping the Act and Finding True Intimacy, in keeping with our theme and our focus on relationships. He's a very funny writer, by the way. And there are 3 chapters I recommend particularly. I'm going to focus on the writing prompts I've put down for this. And I'm going to talk about how I use these in the classroom. So here's some writing prompts, some suggestions. And again, they parallel what Donald Miller's talking about in the chapters I recommend. Write about anyone you consider a hero. Write a true story about yourself that you don't usually tell people. Write a comforting letter to your childhood self from you as an adult now. Write about a time when you feel like you were invisible. Write about a place or a person that makes you feel safe enough to tell the truth about yourself. And what were some of the stories your parents told you about themselves? So you'll notice this is not academic writing I'm asking them to do. This is not the evidence-based writing they're going to need to be able to produce to do well on the high school equivalency tests. This is the kind of writing that I have my students do in the classroom just to get them feeling comfortable with writing. Some students, it's hard to write a complete sentence, much less a paragraph. And so this gives them an opportunity to write about topics that they are experts on because they're writing about themselves. And I don't ask them to show them to me. They can keep it in a folder. If they want me to read it, they can raise the paper up so I can see, and I will read it. I don't mark them up unless they ask me to. One of the things I've done lately is sometimes volunteer students want the whole class to read what they've written and want the whole class to have a group editing exercise. And that's been a worthwhile exercise too. But mostly I'm wanting not only to inspire a love of reading, so my students, when they leave my classroom, and some do it sooner rather than later, I want to have planted seeds of learning and enjoying, even loving reading. And I want to do the same for writing, and this is my attempt to do that. And then we can build on that foundation to help them develop even stronger writing skills for the kind of writing they need in the high school equivalency tests. I highly recommend Heroes for my son, Heroes for my daughter. These books would be especially good for English language learners too, because it's a very brief 2-page spread with some heroes, people who have exhibited exemplary character. And you see a photo of these people, and they're folks, many of them are people you've heard of, many of them are not. And I will often I keep these books in my bookmobile of a car, pull them out, and it's a good, quick read aloud. You can focus on their quotes and focus on their characters and what made them heroic. The 3 books, children's books that parallel what we were reading about Dropping the Act and Finding True Intimacy and Scary Close. One Day, The End, short, very short, shorter than ever stories. This is especially good for beginning English language learners because there's very little written text. There's a lot of diagram, a lot of drawing, and you can tell what's going on. They can articulate, they can talk about, they can speak about what's going on in the drawings. The Invisible Boy, and Desmond and the Very Mean Word. And this was written by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, talking about how he learned forgiveness from his mentor, Father Trevor Huddleston, in South Africa. Very beautiful story. And it would be more mid-level, perhaps more advanced for English language learners. The next book, the last lecture, is actually the first book I read aloud, and I read it cover to cover to my first English, to my first adult basic ed class. And I began reading aloud because my students, when I gave them a 5 or 10 minute break, there were some who would take a 10 or 20 minute break. And I didn't want to have to fuss at them. We're all adults, right? So what I chose to do is after the break, I'd start reading aloud something that was so engaging, it would make them come back into the classroom on time without me having to scold them. And this is what I began reading. The last lecture, it's the story of Randy Pausch, who was diagnosed with cancer, given months to live. And he spoke about in a lecture. It is on the internet. I do include a link for you if you end up reading parts of the book and want to show it. But it's not only recorded and on the internet, it's in this book as well. I recommend 3 chapters that are especially great when we're focusing on relationships. I'll mention at this point that this book, like a few others, are what I call EG. They're not PG, but they're EG. They have strong emotional content and may need just an awareness that they can be triggering. If anyone, has a loved one who is dying or has died, particularly from cancer, it can be triggering. When I read this, I had a 16-year-old in the class, and she got up and walked out, and I found out later that evening that she'd left the room, which is totally fine by me. She left the room because her boyfriend had been killed in an accident recently. But she went to the bookstore and bought this book. She was already hooked and wanted to read it. She just wanted to be able to read it on her own terms. So it's a very good read, very powerful read. There are writing prompts there. The books, the children's books that I recommend with this are what I call my daddy books: The Rag Coat, the story of a young girl whose father passed away; Knock Knock, My Dad's Dream for Me. This is a true story. The author has a very powerful video on a spoken word reading of this book, and that link is in the attachment. Really worth reading, really worth seeing. Ask Me, the story of a father and daughter talking on a walk, and How to Cheer Up Dad. Again, these highlight the relationship, the loving relationship between fathers and their children, and it can serve as a model for all of us as we read about them, talk about them, think about our own relationships with our children, our own relationships with our parents. When we read about relationships that other people have in books, we're not under the microscope and we're not so defensive, but we can think about our relationships and learn about it. I will share with you, I had one student in my class, she's now 21, and I don't even remember what we were reading or what we were talking about, but out of the blue, she said, "This class is making me a better parent." And she went on to get her GED. She's now enrolled in a patient care tech class at Grayson College, which is where I'm home based in Denison, Texas. But that's part of what this is about for me, wanting to encourage my students with their education and in their lives. And so that's just one personal testimony from my classroom. The next book, adult book, Carry On Warrior, The Power of Embracing Your Messy, Beautiful Life by Glennon Doyle Melton. She is hilarious. I could barely narrow it down to 8 chapters. She's a recovered addict, so she has a lot to say about that. She talks about parenting. I've highlighted some really excellent chapters. You might want to check this out, especially if you're looking for something humorous to read. And she's focusing, since she's a woman and a mother, particularly on mothering. The children's books that parallel this. Oops, before I move on, I do want to mention An Elephant in the Living Room, the children's book. So this is a workbook designed to be read aloud to children by a counselor. And I am not that. I assume you are not either. Nevertheless, I find the book so helpful. And so I have it in my lending library to loan to adults who may be affected by people they love who have addiction, and if they're struggling with it themselves. So it's a resource. I've not read this aloud, but it's a resource I have when we're talking about addictions. And so these are 3 of the mommy books, children's books, focusing on the mommy relationship, The Day I Lost My Superpowers. Emmanuel's Dream, the true story of Emmanuel Ofosu Yeboah, a true story from Ghana, and how he was highlighting the treatment of those who were disabled. And of course, he says being disabled does not mean being unable, and talks about a long-distance bike ride he made across his country. There's a film on his story narrated by Oprah Winfrey. There's information about that in the attachment as well. And his mother was his inspiration. So again, it's highlighting the mother-child relationship. And then the final mommy book, The House on Dirty 3rd Street. The next adult book, Tattoos on the Heart, The Power of Boundless Compassion. This also needs some emotional guidance, or just warning that there is strong emotional content. Students in my class and I teared up frequently as we read about this Catholic priest and his church, how they were serving gang members in LA, and in particular the ones who did their time in prison, came out and no longer wanted to do time in a gang. And this ministry is still going on. Gregory Boyle goes around the country, around the world, talking about it. It's a very moving story. I had a 16-year-old on probation in class when I began reading this book. And at one point, he kind of came into the middle of it, and he said he didn't believe it. And I accepted that, but just encouraged him to listen and to decide as he got to know Gregory Boyle through his stories, his words and his actions, if it had the ring of truth for him. In other words, judge his character by what he says and does, and then decide. And this young man loved the book in the end. And in the end, we watched the film G-Dog that gives you a chance to see Father Greg in action. That's mentioned in the attachment. 2 children's books that parallel these themes: Enemy Pie, how a little boy lost his best enemy because he ended up becoming his best friend, and Grandfather Gandhi, written by Arun Gandhi, the grandson of Gandhi, and a lesson he learned in how to deal with his anger from his famously nonviolent grandfather. The children's, those are the children's books. The next adult book also has strong emotional and violent content, is Strength in What Remains, a journey of remembrance and forgiveness, the story of a young man, Deo, who arrives in New York City with $200 in his pocket, no English at all, and memories of horror because he'd escaped genocide in Burundi in 1994. The first half of this book is so worth reading. My English language learners, students, really could relate to it. And if you don't read the whole half of the book, the first 3 chapters talk about his escape from Burundi, and then it flashes forward to when he first arrived in New York City and he was homeless, and the kindness he was shown by Americans, which landed him in ESL classes and also in med school. Chapter 3 talks about when he was growing up in Burundi in the 1970s. And so if you don't read all the way to the halfway point of the book, you might be interested, even if you read some of it, to know that he didn't go all the way through med school, but he got enough training that he went back to Burundi, to his hometown, and has built clinics in the area. And again, you can check that out online. So the children's books that parallel these things: Brothers in Hope, the story of the lost boys of Sudan. This is based on a true story. My Name is Sungul. This is a fictional story about a refugee from Sudan who came to America. And then 14 Cows for America. And this is the story of a young man from a village in Kenya being educated in the United States, but after 9/11, he returned to his village to inform the village fathers what had happened in America. And it tells the story of their great sacrificial and symbolic gift accepted by the American ambassador, a gift of 14 cows for America. And if you were to read this after reading about Deo in Burundi in chapter 3 and hearing the significance, how cows are collateral, cows are like their bank accounts in this part in these villages in this part of the world, both are very moving stories. So I recommend them all. Let's see, the last nonfiction book I'm recommending is Reviving Ophelia, Saving the Selves of Adolescent Girls by Mary Pfeiffer. She is a clinical psychologist, and this is an oldie but goodie. It was first published in 1994, and I've been pushing it on family and friends for years. And if you have adult students who have daughters, and particularly teenage daughters, and women who were teenagers, I didn't read this until I was a full-grown woman, and it brought tears to my eyes just to better understand myself. The one chapter, I'd loan this to a student. I wouldn't read the whole thing aloud, but I would read large excerpts from chapter 13, entitled What I've Learned from Listening. pages 248 to 259. Again, I'm getting very specific with this. This book is like having a mini counseling session in one chapter. It's very practical, very helpful for anyone relating, not just to teenage girls, but just relating to people and relating to yourself. And I got very specific with some of her quotes and some of the writing prompts that you might want to check out. I'll read a few of them for those of you who might not have it in front of you. Talking about what are some of your long-term goals? What are some of your victories? Write about past experiences or future events to remind you that you're not always going to be where you are right now. What are some ways that you have or could help other people on a regular basis? And in the chapter, Mary Pfeiffer talks about how therapeutic thinking about, talking about, having someone listen to you, even if you're just writing to yourself on a piece of paper and listening to your own thoughts on these topics, how therapeutic that can be. The children's books that parallel this chapter in Reviving Ophelia, An's Anger. It's the story of a very wise grandfather, how he helps his grandson deal with his anger, telling him to please go to your room and sit with your anger. One of those days, this is a good one for the beginning English language learners. Again, there's not a lot of text. And even though we all have one of those days, those bad days, it ends up on a bright note because one of those days turns into a new day, turns into another day. But it's a fun read. And then The Last Stop on Market Street is the story of a Nana, of a grandmother, and her relationship and how she relates to and is teaching her grandson. Beautiful, beautiful story. And finally, the last adult book I'm recommending is Miss Julia Stands Her Ground. I am not recommending the whole book. It's one of 20 books that Ann B. Ross has written about Miss Julia. This is fiction. This is funny. What I'm recommending, and this is a great time of year to read it, is chapters 15 through 30. And if you read those chapters, those 16 chapters, you can skip a chapter here and there. But this is the story. It's a flashback. And it's a Christmas story, and that's why I like to, I first read it 3 years ago, these chapters to a couple of my classes, and now 3 years later, I think starting next week, I'll be reading these chapters again. It's a flashback of how Miss Julia, who's a very proper Southern lady, well-bred Southern lady, who on the outside is all manners and politeness, but because she's telling the story, you are privy to her inner musings, which are very funny and not always polite. Anyway, this flashback takes her back to the time when she discovered her husband of 45 years had had an affair, had a mistress who arrived at her doorstep with their 9-year-old son. And it's the story of how she ended up having them in her home. And as they were anticipating and ended up spending and even celebrating Christmas together, how she fell in love with her dead husband's illegitimate son and his mistress. It's a delightful story of forgiveness, and one that I found that my adult students can easily relate to. And I think it's special because it's the only fiction book I've put on this list of mostly biographies and autobiographies. There is a parallel children's book, also a Christmas story, The Christmas Miracle of Jonathan Toomey. No one ever called him Mr. Gloomy again because a woman and a young boy also arrived at this widower's doorstep, and it's a sweet story as well. So that was a quick review of the titles, the authors, the chapters, the pages, the writing prompts and parallel illustrated children's books that I have to share with you and to recommend to you. At this point, I'm wondering if you have questions about, or I'd love in the chat box if you'll put recommendations that you might have about reading aloud to adults. I'm going to try this slow move. Let's see, back to, let me see if I can. Here we go. Actually, I may be able to leave this up. Let me see if I can leave this up. And let me see. Nope, I got to get out of this. I'm sorry, folks. So let me see if I can get to, okay, go away. I'm going to try and get to, okay. So I'm going to go to the Q&A now, and let's see. Okay, so looks like, are you Kat? Bradley Bennett asked, do you give them silent reading time before you do the read aloud? So I spend more time reading aloud to them, and I do give them opportunities to read aloud themselves, but not in our read aloud books. We also have workbooks and GED resources that involve reading, and I always ask for volunteers if they want to read. But when it comes to our read aloud, our read alouds, that's become a pretty sacred time, and not just for me, for my students as well. And I want them to hear the fluent reading. I want to be able to model, you know, stopping at appropriate times and asking yourselves these questions. So they do work independently. They do read silently. They also read aloud, but not just some of these read aloud selections. I wouldn't have students take a turn reading these aloud. And I hope that answered your question. So another attendee asked, how do adults react to being read a children's book? Don't they find it too kiddie? Of course, that's an excellent question. Here's what I'm gonna say to you. I teach adult basic education. I teach high school equivalency. I have not read, with the exception of Wolfie the Bunny, I have not read these children's books in my adult classroom. But I believe in the English language learner classrooms, particularly the stories that are based on true stories about Gandhi or about Archbishop Desmond Tutu, stories that may be based in our English language learning classes. Some of our students may be from some of these areas. And so I included those on my list for those of you who are working with adults in English language learning classrooms. Also knowing that so many of our adults have kids or grandkids, and they may want to, as you model for them how to read, you can pose it like you can take this home and interact with your children and talk about the book with your children or grandchildren. But I appreciate the question, because I do think it's, you don't want them to feel like they're being talked down to. And if the subject is too kiddie, they may feel that way. So that is something we'd want to guard against. And so another question, Summer Ellis asked, with such a focus on academic rigor and test performance, how often or regularly do you devote to this type of work and literary work specifically? Okay, so let's be real here. Up until just a few months ago, I had 6-hour classes 2 days a week. So I had my students in my classroom 12 hours a week, and it was a 6-hour class. And I had 2 classes, and I would go back and forth, but each class, each high school equivalency class, it was a 6-hour class. And so I read regularly then, particularly if I'm working through chapters in a book. And I would spend about 15, 20, sometimes 30 minutes on it. But because I'm whipping out this more than 20 questions to ask while reading, I'm modeling, we're talking about the kinds of questions they'll get on the GED test. I can use that for anything we read, whether it's a blog, whether it's a news article. When you ask these questions like, you know, what conclusions can you draw? What's the main idea? Sorry about that, folks. What's the main idea? You can apply these kinds of questions to anything that you're reading. So now I have 4-hour classes. I have my students in the classroom 8 hours a week. And I don't get to read aloud from these kinds of read alouds every single class period. They miss it when I don't. I miss it when I don't. But we are having to be, I'm finding I have to be not only more rigorous, I have less time to do it. So that's the for real answer. So thank you for the questions. Any other questions? We're about 5 minutes out. Let's see. I don't have any other questions. Anyone have titles that you would like to recommend? Either things you have read aloud in your classroom, or maybe you've read on your own, and as you think about it, you realize that some or maybe even all of it would be good to answer, good to read aloud and discuss in the classroom. Any titles that come to your mind? Let's see, did I have another question? Okay, here we have another one. Okay, so we have used Holes, Walk to Moons, The Giver, and Winn-Dixie to advanced ESL students in a summer reading program, but it was a combination of them reading silently and hearing it read aloud. And so I guess my question for you is, when they're reading it silently, you mean they have the text in front of them while the teacher is reading aloud to them so they can see it and hear it? I'm guessing that's what you're saying you did, and that's exactly what I'm doing too. I do not read aloud I don't read aloud anything. I don't read aloud anything, not even from a GED handbook, without each of my students having the handbook in front of them, or more often than not, I'm projecting it onto a screen, because I want them to see the words as I read it. I want them to see the words as another student reads it. So yes, my students are reading it silently. They're reading along while I'm reading it. I want them to see the text while they're hearing me read it, or hearing anyone read it. So I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about that. That is indeed how I approach it. So any other titles that you'd recommend, either for English language learners or adult basic education students? If not, my guess is if we stick around a little bit, you'll be able to see the chat box. But at this point, I'm also guessing we're about 3 minutes out from closing. And so we may be wrapping this up shortly. I will thank all of you for spending this hour with me, and I hope you'll have a chance to look a little more closely at what I have done a survey of some of these handouts, and I hope you find something that will be useful to you in your classrooms, and something you'll enjoy sharing with your students. Okay, so let's see. I'm gonna go like this. Here we've got Wolfie the bunny waving goodbye. And I will also flash up on the screen my name and my email address in case you did have any follow-up questions or comments. I'd be happy to hear from you. I love talking about reading aloud in the adult education classroom because it's been such a positive and rewarding experience for my students and for me. And so it's something I enjoy.